What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. Oh man, I was listening to Forget Me Not by Saint Germain. Dude, I love that song. It's got this really cool jazzy hip hop vibe to it, and it just sounds amazing. Like Saint Germain makes some really good music. I want to say it's from the album of Tourist. I'm not going to swear to that though, but it's one of the coolest songs that you're ever going to hear. Which, by the way, a guy actually put together a Spotify playlist of all the songs I've ever used, and I have it on my Twitter account. You can find me at Comments Explain. It's on there somewhere. I don't know where, but it's been posted within the last day or so it should be relatively easy to find. But anyway, so Groot versus the Hulk. All right, here's the deal. This is 1976, right? This is Hulk Annual number 5, written by Lynn Wein and Chris Claremont. So it's 1976 comics, guys. This was the era of comic books, really before Peter David took over, and the Incredible Hulk was just kind of free-floating from one villain to the next. And so it was just kind of, you'd see these stories crop up, and the Hulk would just like accidentally stumble into some place he shouldn't be, and it would lead to him fighting against, humans, which in turn would lead to the arrival of superheroes, and then the Hulk would fight against superheroes, and then he would just say, you know what, I've had enough, and he would leave, and the story would be over. That was pretty much the Incredible Hulk from like the 1960s to the 1980s. Really when like Bill Mantlo, I think it was, took over, and when Peter David took over. So again, it was kind of one of these things where it was just sort of just free-floating stories. But Groot, the way you think of him, is not the way he originally appeared in Marvel Comics. His first appearance came in Tales to Astonish number 13 in 1960, and he was a Stan Lee, Jack Kirby creation. So again, it's kind of cool to see that he predates like the Fantastic Four, and he predates Spider-Man and those guys. But it was kind of one of these things, right? In like the early days of Marvel Comics, Stan Lee and Jack Kirby were just like writing stuff and sending it out, or really making stuff. Jack Kirby was the one drawing it, but they were just making stuff and sending it out. And that was the pattern. It was just like, make it, send it, make it, send it, make it, send it. And it was good because it gave us things like the X-Men, the Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, Doctor Doom, Iron Man, so on and so forth. But then we had things like Groot pop up. And the way he originally appeared, he was just like this thing, just like this giant, Flora Colossi, or really he was just like a monster at the time from Planet X. I mean, they didn't really give him a name. It was just like the monster from Planet X. And so the result was that he was just this guy who showed up on Earth for the purpose of just like capturing humans and then experimenting on them, like studying them. And that was really it. But the way it was done was kind of weird because 1960s comics was a little strange. And what ended up happening is some guy named Leslie Evans basically ran to the cops and said, hey, look, there's this giant tree monster that's terrorizing the town. The cops said, whatever, man, get off your drugs. You're a crazy person. So Leslie Evans came back. He developed like these artificial termites that basically ate Groot, and that was the end of him. Like that was basically it. It was a pretty gruesome way for him to go out. But what ended up happening is there were a series of stories, or at least there was a series of stories involving a guy named Zenmu. I think is how you pronounce it. It's Xenmu. And this guy was basically just a dude from another dimension. And again, that's where a lot of those stories hailed from. It was kooky locations, beings that just kind of popped up out of nowhere. And ultimately, Zenmu kind of had a couple campaigns, but one of the most notable was going against the Defenders, which at the time was Doctor Strange, Namor, Silver Surfer, and the Incredible Hulk. And again, it was just Marvel's attempt to kind of bolster the roster of the Defenders. Nobody really bought into it because it just kind of seemed like a poor man's Avengers. But the fact remains here that one of the most notable heroes that Zenmu had gone against was the Incredible Hulk. And so where Zenmu had constantly been banished from the planet Earth, what ended up happening is he basically made his arrival once more and was just plotting world domination underground. But the Incredible Hulk in this particular story had basically stumbled across a military base, and the arrival of the Incredible Hulk came to the attention of Zenmu, who in turn began developing or basically recreating all these different monsters of superior strength that had existed and used them to try to take down the Incredible Hulk. So we don't really know about the other three just because they're things like Goom and stuff like that. It's weird. Like they're like mud monsters and like lava monsters and so on and so forth. They're kind of hokey and a little bit silly, but Groot, as he's depicted here, was basically recreated. Now, the funny thing about this is, remember, this is not the Groot that you know. I mean, it's, in terms of his strength and in terms of his power and so on and so forth, he's still very much similar in the sense that he's just a giant tree. But the idea here is that he speaks in clear and concise sentences. And again, this was really just part of the whole, Dan Abnett / Brian Michael Bendis / Marvel redoing their whole cosmology thing when they brought Groot back. And all he did was just say, I am Groot. I mean, that was kind of the lovable nature of him. And of course, that led into its own line of stories in terms of what it is that Groot's really saying. But the idea here is that seeing him and the Incredible Hulk fight one another is actually pretty wild, because keep in mind, Groot is wildly strong in terms of where he stands, but the Incredible Hulk has limitless strength. And again, at this point, it wasn't really like the upper echelons of the Hulk strength, like what we saw in all my videos, by Greg Pak with the Incredible Hulk, where it was like World Breaker Hulk and like Heart of the Monster Hulk, where he's just got like the power of gods and he could take down some of the higher, some of the most powerful beings in existence, or at least some of the most powerful physical beings in existence. He couldn't really punch eternity, I doubt, but the fact remains here that with him going against Groot is very much just kind of an exchange. It's pretty straightforward. And that's what these comics were. These comics were just really straightforward things. There wasn't a lot to go into. There wasn't a lot of discussion. It was just Groot trying to wreck him. But the funny thing about this is that at the time when Groot was written here, because he was a Flora Colossi, meaning that he was basically just a giant tree, he would root himself into the ground. And what it would do is it would make him almost impossible to stop. You really just couldn't move him. I mean, once his roots were embedded down into the ground, it was almost impossible to make him go anywhere. And that's kind of what happens back and forth between these two. Of course, the Incredible Hulk had never fought Groot before. And so because of that, the Hulk's actually kind of trying to figure out what in the world is going on. Because remember, from the Hulk's perspective, when somebody gets in his way, they get smashed and the Hulk goes on. It's one of the 3 core rules of the universe, right? Like the Cleveland Browns will never go to the Super Bowl, your girlfriend and or wife is always right, and the Incredible Hulk basically crushes everything that he goes against. But when he's facing off against Groot, because of the fact that Groot is rooted into the ground, it's almost impossible for the Hulk to stop him. Now, the other half of this is Groot uses things, like these invincible thorns and different things like that. So remember, his powers are very much rooted in terms of tree-based aspects. Now, this doesn't really take into account what things we would see later on when the role of Groot is expanded in Marvel Comics, and he's basically able to ensnare people and extend his own limbs and different things like that. It doesn't really work that way. Right now, he's just a really, really strong tree, more or less. But ultimately, once Hulk realizes that the basis behind Groot's near indestructibility is the fact that he is rooted into the ground, the Incredible Hulk in turn just smashes the ground, uproots Groot, and then just wrecks him. And that's really it. I mean, he just tears him to pieces, just starts smashing him apart with rocks. And that's pretty much the end of him. I mean, Groot just basically vanishes. Now, the funny thing about this is that this would be the portrayal of Groot going forward for a lot of stories in Marvel Comics. He would pop up every once in a while. And I mean like once in a blue moon he would appear, because he's one of those characters that Marvel always wanted to kind of keep on the back burner, not really to keep fans relevant, keep fans interested in him, but keep him on the back burner simply for copyright purposes. Because remember, whenever it comes to characters or something like that, if a character is created and they lapse for any real measure of time, like decades, then it can ultimately lead to them, potentially losing that character. Now, I can't imagine why DC would basically try to claim Groot for their own. I have a hard time imagining what a story would look like with Superman versus Groot. I would read it, but I have a hard time imagining what that story would look like. It would be awesome. Dude, I would love to see that, like a Green Lantern Groot. Could you imagine that? Like Groot gets like the Green Lantern, is like, I am Lantern. It would be amazing. It would be an awesome story. But the fact remains here that with Groot as you know him, again, when Dan Abnett was kind of going through, and because the story is so short, I think we can afford to kind of have this little bit of an explanation here. But because of the fact that, Dan Abnett and those guys had basically co-opted the entirety of the Marvel cosmology and then turned around and made it cohesive and expanded on it, which again, we'll cover all that cosmic stuff next year, Groot was basically just kind of rolled into the fold. And for the most part, this version of Groot was just kind of long and forgotten. They basically just sort of ignored him and just kind of left him behind, which made sense because nobody really had a reason to sit down, while they were reading Annihilation. It's like, but wait a minute, what happened to that version of Groot who was like really eloquent and talked well and was fighting the Hulk in Hulk Annual number 5? I mean, nobody really had a reason to ask that question, especially when the Guardians of the Galaxy movie came out. People just wanted to see like the Groot that they were familiar with in the film, which, of course you find in modern day Guardians of the Galaxy stories. But in any event, guys, I just kind of wanted to throw this out there, just kind of have this little bit of a video, we were talking about the Incredible Hulk fighting Groot. It's a cool little moment. It's a cool little segment just to kind of see the two go head to head. In truth, I wouldn't be surprised if later on down the line, we saw a tried and true story with like a modern day Bruce Banner going against a modern day Groot. I think that story would be more identifiable and more relatable to people who are out there looking to see a story like that. I think it'd be a little more grounded and they'd be, be able to get a little more invested into it. But in any event, guys, if you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoy this video, make sure you drop a like, and yeah, I will catch you all later. Peace.